Welcome to Advocacy Insights, where we go over the happenings that is going on in Congress, in the administration, and at the state level that impact the environmental health community. I'm Doug Farquhar. I direct government affairs for NiHA, and I'll be hosting the Advocacy Insights. We're going to be going over the latest going on in Congress, which isn't much, over any federal policy updates that may be going on in the administration, and finally, we'll be discussing about what's been enacted in the state legislative sessions this year that affect environmental health. As many of you know, I'm a big fan of state legislatures. That's where I come from, that's my background, and that's where I spend most of my time working with them about environmental health policy. Environmental health policy is profoundly local, as often is stated by our CEO, Dr. David Dijak. And when you take a look at state legislation in 2024, you see that's very true. In reviewing state legislation and policies across the board this year, it's been the state legislatures and the states that have been quite active. Congress, on the other hand, has not been very active at all. Out of the 3,189 bills that they introduced during the 118th Congress, only 80 have passed, and most of them have had to deal with the naming of federal facilities. 15 of them deal with providing names to different federal facilities across the country. That leaves 65 of them to deal with all the other problems out there. They did pass things such as the Electronic Duck Stamp Act, which allows states to issue fully electronic stamps. But they haven't passed anything of significance. They haven't passed anything dealing with PFAS, or dealing with food safety, or dealing with anything that deals with environmental health, and that includes their appropriations, which is their foremost responsibility. The 118th Congress has not passed any appropriation for fiscal year 24, which began last October, in October of 2023. At that time, they had an agreement between Speaker McCartney and President Biden. They had an agreement on what the levels will be, and it looked like things were going to move forward. But in the House, Republicans rejected those agreements, and they responded by throwing Kevin McCarthy out as Speaker and then bringing in Mike Johnson. Speaker Johnson had been advocating for them and since, but we haven't gotten very far. We've basically been in limbo. We haven't been able to find out what the final line items will be for fiscal year 24, which, like I said, began in October of 2023, which means that fiscal year 25 should begin in 2 weeks on October 1st of 2024. But we haven't even figured out the fiscal year 2024 budget yet. That means fiscal year 25 is way behind. It should have already been enacted. But they haven't even discussed it. They haven't even come up with figures of it because they're still dealing with fiscal year 2024. Congress has been very much all over the board when it comes to the budget. We have seen bills come out of the House Appropriators. We have seen legislation come out of the Senate on items that are most dear to environmental health. But between the two chambers, they're not even close. Coming to a single number for anything that we are really concerned about. From the House, which is run by the Republicans, they came up with a very conservative number for the CDC, National Center for Environmental Health. They came up with a figure of 96 million. The Senate, on the other hand, they came up with a figure of 250 million, which is close to what the CDC received in the fiscal year 23 budget. But between those two numbers, the Senate and the House are going to have to figure out a compromise number that is going to allow the National Center for Environmental Health to move forward under fiscal year 24. It's probably not going to happen until after the election. Both sides are counting on their side winning, and if they do win the election, it's going to give them leverage about which direction they'll go. If the Republicans make significant wins, then they'll go ahead and go with their lower amounts of around $96 million. And we could see The same go across in FDA, for EPA, and in HUD and at USDA. But if the Democrats win, we'll probably see the higher levels going on, at least level funding from fiscal year 23, and maybe even seeing an increase. For other programs that we're concerned about, such as FDA's Human Food Program budget, it's a little bit less controversial. The Senate's looking at around 350 million. The House is looking at around 330 million. And those are numbers that you can negotiate and come up with a sensible response. EPA, on the other hand, is not looking as well. Under the Republican budget, they're only going to be getting 7.3 billion for fiscal year 24. That's 2 billion lower than what the president is requesting. So the EPA is relying on the Senate to come up with to make up their budget for these losses. As for the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, which is ATSDR, they received 76 million for fiscal year 24 under the House. NiHA, on the other hand, is requesting 100 million for their fiscal year budget. For EPA, we're requesting 12 billion. We'll see if those numbers actually come through. Much is going to depend on how the election turns out. Other areas are controversial as well. The House Republican appropriators basically deleted the entire budget for the National Center for Injury, which is one of those foremost key centers within the CDC. So there's going to be an enormous amount of negotiations that's going to have to occur between the House and the Senate after the election to see if they can actually come up with some numbers that they both can agree on and both can get their chambers to adopt. In the meantime, in order to keep the government open, Congress must pass continuing resolutions. They've been doing that ever since of October of last year. They've had numbers that they've agreed on, and they wanted to move forward every time, but they're going to have to figure out in moving forward if they're going to be able to agree on the same numbers and if they are going to be able to get enough votes to move those continuing resolution forward. If either the House or the Senate puts up enough blocks, the continuing resolution will not pass and the government will shut down, which is something neither party wants to see this close to the election. They want to make sure the government stays running. But if their side wins significantly enough, they will have a stronger say in what the budget will be come November. That being said, Speaker Mike Johnson, right now he's having trouble corralling enough members of his own party to move forward with the current continuing resolution. He's in a tight spot. He can only lose 2 members of his caucus in order to pass a continuing resolution. So that means that either the entire Republican caucus has to be united, or they will the continuing resolution will not pass. Right now, the continuing resolution has a couple of controversial statements which may hold it back. One of them is the SAVE Act, which makes for illegal aliens unable to vote in elections. Now, that's currently against the law, but this provides additional support. The other one is the date for the continuing resolution. The current continuing resolution that Speaker Mike Johnson is putting forward his caucus is to go forward until March of 2025. The Democrats would like to see the continuing resolution end at December of 2024. They want to see a fresh new fiscal budget year start in 2025. That means there's a little discrepancy between the two. It's not that it's massive, but it also means that it's enough that Speaker Johnson may not be able to get the continuing resolution passed in the House, let alone agreed to in the Senate. With that being said, if he does not have enough House Republican votes, he's going to have to rely on Democrats to make up for it to pass the continuing resolution. To do that, he's going to have to get rid of the SAVE Act and get rid and modify the date from the end of March to the end of December. And with that, if he does get a vote on that, that's positive. It would get out of the House and will move over to the Senate. The Senate will probably agree to the continuing resolution, and that would leave it up to the president to sign and allow the government to stay open, at least through the election. Now, regarding NiHA, we have been very active in Congress, even though Congress has not been very active. And the federal government, well, it's been acting mostly as a lame duck operation because President Biden is not running again. But we have been active in promoting environmental health before Congress and the administration. We led the response to specifically include environmental health workforce in the Public Health Workforce Loan Forgiveness Program before HRSA. We continue to follow up with congressional appropriators of the Workforce Loan Forgiveness Program, asking them to fund it at $100 million. We're also involved to make sure that the CDC budget comes in at levels that are adequate, at least at level funding from fiscal year 23. Right now, the National Center for Environmental Health is getting $250 million, which is what the Senate has been advocating. But as I mentioned before, the House came forward with $96 million. That means there's going to be quite a bit of negotiation, and we want to make sure that Congress understands where we're coming in on those two figures. For the $350 million for the FDA Human Foods Program is a number that NiHA has moved forward with and has been advocating before Congress. But none of these bills have been finalized. We have quite a ways to go, but we have ensured that the voice of environmental health has been heard in Congress, not only by myself, but by members who have come up to our Hill Day in March and spoke about how important the federal budget is for their local community and for environmental health in their states. In discussing states, well, that's where much more activity occurred. We've seen 846 bills relating to environmental health introduced during this time period. And that is the 2024 state legislative sessions. And during that time, 202 bills have been enacted or adopted. That means 28% of bills relating to environmental health introduced in 2024 have been enacted, which is an incredibly high number. Normally, you see only about 10% of all bills introduced adopted. We saw close to 30% of the environmental health bills adopted. We've also identified 250 bills that relate to body art. 27 of those bills have been enacted. That's more closer to the normal number of 10%. When it comes to climate change, we saw 104 bills introduced, and 24 of them have been enacted. Drinking water, 179 bills were introduced across the state legislatures. 33 of them were enacted. Regarding food safety, we saw 356 bills being introduced, 5 being enacted. And regarding indoor air quality, 59 bills were introduced. 10 have been enacted to date. Those are really good numbers for actually seeing bills introduced. Overall, we only see about 10% of bills enacted in any given year. And that's out of 76,756 bills that are introduced. As I noted, we saw 856 bills introduced regarding environmental health that we tracked this year. That comes down to 1,668 bills per legislature that is introduced every year. So that means environmental health saw quite a bit of activity in the states this year. And that's also in lieu of the fact that 4 states, Texas, North Dakota, Montana, and Nevada, weren't even in session this year. So out of 46 states which were in session this year, 1,600, each one of them adopted around 1,600 bills. Now that varies among the states. New Jersey introduced the most bills, 8,758 bills for the 2024 legislative session. Michigan introduced the least number. They only introduced 796 bills. Regarding enactment, Arkansas enacted the most bills. They enacted 98% of all bills that were introduced. 181 bills were enacted out of 184. Colorado was the second most. They adopted 76% of all bills introduced. In both states, one party controls the House, the Senate, and the governorship. In Arkansas, it's the Republicans controlling the House and the Senate, with Sarah Huckabee as the governor. In Colorado, Democrats have majorities in the House and the Senate, and their governor is Jared Polis, a Democrat. So with that combination, it leads to a very successful pass rate. Other states, not so much. Alaska only enacted 10 bills. They're notorious for not enacting a lot of legislation, though. In Ohio, they passed only 13 bills to date. However, they have a year-round legislature, so they could enact more bills as time moves on. But since we're in the middle of an election season, most members want to be in their home districts campaigning rather than at the Capitol passing bills. So we may not see many more bills passed than what we've seen so far. So for Advocacy Insights, that's where we stand at this point on what's going on at the federal government, what's going on in Congress, what's going on in the administration, and what we're hearing of in the states. Next month, we're going to talk about the implications of the upcoming election and see how that might impact the environmental health workforce and the environmental health activities. We're also going to go over the number of enacted food safety legislation, which we have put out in a report on our website at www.niha.org. With that, this is Doug Farquhar, Director of Government Affairs, saying thank you for joining us today on Advocacy Insights.